Yeah,
All right. So hi there and welcome to Poetry Passages. I'm Clifford Rames, and I'm so thrilled to be here today with my guest, Shangyang Fang. Shangyang is a poet from Chengdu, China, who is currently a Wallace Stegner Fellow at Stanford University in California. The recipient of the 2019 Gregory O'Donoghue International Poetry Prize, Shangyang beat out over 2,000 other entrants with his winning poem, Argument of Situations. Shangyang's debut collection of poetry, Burying the Mountain, was just released by Copper Canyon Press and it is a gorgeous book on many levels, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And I'll put the link to the book in the comment section below the video, so anybody who wants to check it out can. And so it's a real pleasure, Shangyang, for having you with us today, and an honor. Welcome, and thanks for coming on the program.
thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Clifford.
My pleasure. So, for viewers who are just hearing your name perhaps for the first time or learning about you today for the first time, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. There's not much about me. I'm Shangyang. I am from China. I came to US for college when I was 17 years old alone. I studied civil and environmental engineering, but I couldn't resist the urge to write poems. I remember I skipped many classes to read poetry books in the library. I do not recommend that. And by miracle, I am still writing.
Well, we're glad you are. So you said you started writing not that long ago. How long ago was it?
I started writing in Chinese very early since I was a kid. But in English, I started really writing English poetry when I was a sophomore in college.
So yesterday, basically. No, I'm just
Yeah,
kidding.
I wish it was yesterday.
No, it's totally amazing. And so you mentioned you started reading these books. So I wanted to ask you about who were some of your early influences and current influences among the poets that you read. Were there any in particular?
Yeah, of course. Well, how I started, I think I started just scribbling as a child. I mentioned I was influenced by my grandfather a lot. So my
Mm,
early influence would be writing in classical meters and forms of Chinese poetry. Or rather, I think I was just filling words into the metric pattern. It was really like a word game,
right.
and I think that gave shape to my voice as well as my emotion through the meticulous forms of poetry. And later in middle school and high school, I was influenced by the Chinese translation of European modernist poets like George Trakl, Garcia Lorca, Paul Celan, Osip Mandelstam, these poets. And I started writing free verse in Chinese. I came to United States and I still now trying to conjure up something using this foreign language. Yeah,
So you basically started by taking the form and sort of inserting
right.
words and seeing what worked and what didn't. It's fascinating. Uh, so you, as I said earlier, burying the mountain, I think, in my opinion, and I spent a lot of time with this book, is just a gorgeous, gorgeous book on so many levels.
Thank you.
From the subtle beauty of the cover, which is a watercolor painting by Ye Chang, to the awe-inspiring imagery within the poems themselves. And if you indulge me for a moment, I want to read some of my descriptors that I wrote as I was passing
Oh,
through the
please, I would
book.
love to hear. Thank you.
And it's like Burying the Mountain is a book filled with longing and loss, arrows and exile, insatiable desire and persistent desperation, as well as soaring music and fallen gods. There's bitter disappointment with the world on one hand, and while on the other hand, an irresistible craving to devour all of its wonders and sensual pleasures. So Does that kind of sum it up for you?
That's so beautiful. I don't think my book deserved that description, but
Oh,
it's wonderful. Thank you.
well, it's a
Thank you.
book. Honestly, it's a book I return to over and over again to be astonished. And kudos to you because yeah, it's something, and I recommend that everybody check it out. But can you just tell us more about the sort of genesis, the creation story of this book? What was the driving force for the poems? Where did the inspiration come from? Where did the title come from?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's no uh, inevitability of how this book happened. It's just out of occasion, just along the way, because of my passion for poetry, just page after page. There isn't a project for it. I think if there is a driving force, and that would be the sense of being away, a sense of alienation, and that includes solitude and isolation. Not only physically being away from my home country and my family, but also metaphysically, that I felt constantly alienated by the reality, as you talked about.
Right.
I ventured to search home in language, guided by language. The title really came out of nowhere. I was drinking with a bunch of friends in Austin, Texas. It's always summer there. And I was sharing the potential titles of my graduate thesis. All of them are bad, terrible. So I went out to the yard with a half bottle of beer, looking at the evening sky. And I was tipsy, properly tipsy. And the clouds were forming into something that resembles a mountain. I looked at it and felt it was a ritual for burial somehow. And the title just hit my mind. And I went to the house and told my friends this new title. They liked it and I kept it. They hated all my previous titles and they liked the new one. So I kept it. And yeah, that's the story of the title.
Well, in there is sort of an allusion to the title in your poem "Argument of Situations" towards the end,
Right, the
which you're not going to
ending.
read today because it's one of your most popular poems, and I think people can readily find it. I think you read it on Rattle recently, but there is that allusion to it. So I was wondering if there was any I guess the title come first or the poem come first.
I Yeah, the poem comes first,
Right.
and
Yeah.
I think somehow the last lines of the poem I couldn't understand it even if I finished it. But yeah, I think this is how I deal with most of my work. I don't understand what I'm doing. Uh, I
I
hope I
love
get
it.
better at doing what I don't understand. But I think the ending lines of that poem just forming unconsciously in my mind until that moment when I look at the cloud with a beer in my
Sure.
hand, and the title just came to me
So
very
a
naturally.
lot of your poem, you surprise yourself with your own poetry. That's
I
wonderful.
hope that's always the goal, but it
Yeah.
doesn't necessarily. It's very hard. I fail numerous
No.
times.
Well, I noticed there's a number of references to art and
Mhm.
mythology in your poems, and particular in Foretaste of Disaster, you create this sort of hybrid of art and mythology, a sort of ekphrastic tribute to Anthony Van Dyck's sort of self-portrait, I believe, painting of Icarus. Um, I would guess that it's a painting that you would admire. And what's the story behind that poem and painting?
The story, this poem actually has a story. Um, there are poems that don't, but it's a painting that surprised me, and I did not know this painting until I saw it in person in Boston. I'm just a devoted fan of art and music, and when I was at Boston Museum of Fine Art, uh, I was visiting there, and it's the day before my 25th birthday. I felt it felt like a threshold of my life at the moment, the quarter of a century. And at the moment, I was questioning my faith in poetry, not sure if I should carry on. And then I saw this painting by Anthony van Dyck in the museum, and I was immediately astonished and transfixed. I stood in front of it for a long, long time and felt I was transported to a different space time.
Right.
And later, I learned that Van Dyck made this self-portrait as Icarus in his early 20s. And I thought, what madness, what arrogance, and what courage and passion to embrace the known tragedy of life as an artist. And to me, the painting shows a shrewd interpretation of fatalism. And also, as a poet, I always had a desire to write about Icarus because it's
Yeah.
such a famous and just incredible story. But because the subject has been overexploited in poetry, and because there are already so many masterpieces about it, I was afraid to make my own version.
Yeah.
But at that moment, I thought, it's my birthday tomorrow. I can do whatever I want to do. I'm going to write this poem, and the
Right.
fearlessness in Van Dyck's painting inspired me. And
Inspired you.
yeah, so very rarely I indulge myself writing an ekphrasis about it.
There is an irreverence, of him inserting his face on the face of Icarus, and
Oh yeah,
I think he was actually only 19 when he did it. It's like,
really?
yeah, that's what
Wow.
I read. It's quite possible that it's close to being true, but early 20s, 19, it's still an amazing accomplishment,
It is
regardless.
truly an amazing accomplishment. When I saw it and I saw the age he created that, I
Mm.
thought maybe I should stop writing poems
Give
or
it all up,
like
right?
just give it up, or I
No,
should
please
just
don't.
dive in fearlessly as
Well,
he did.
it's a stunning poem, and I was hoping that you would read it for us today. Would you
Oh,
do
sure.
that? Yeah.
Yeah, my pleasure. Um,
Foretaste of Disaster.
Foretaste of Disaster. Young, therefore vain and wingless, he lets his father tie a blue thread around his chest. It is before the famous tragedy, the fall, before the imminent sea. The coast still composed in subdued hues and regimented patterns, the abstraction of waves has yet to be mutilated by a scream. Human position yet to be tested. He, at his prime, Anthony Van Dyck, blazing like an overripe Flemish peach, presented this self-portrait in which an old man tethers a wing to a young man's pale, well-knit back. Here, grief has yet to become visible, as in Bruegel's stick out of the water, legs white as boiled chicken. In his early 20s, Icarus, the trespasser or cross-dresser, was punished for his pride. In his early 20s, Van Dyck portrayed himself as Icarus in a painting in front of which I stand looking him in the eyes. Tomorrow, I'll be a quarter of a century old. My father disappeared like an antelope into the dawning gold. But if and when Icarus survives his drowning, stepping out of the sea as if out of a Kavafi poem, dripping with synonyms of passion and desire, who will untie the blue thread from his chest? Who will save me? Come to change my life.
Wow. Who's gonna tie wings on you? But you already have wings. I mean, this your poetry are your wings.
Thank you. I hope so.
Well, you have your poetry has such you have such a distinctive style and voice. And I was thinking about, have I come across anything like, who would I compare it to? And Ocean Vuong crossed my mind, but really, I think it's hard to pinpoint. Your voice is very unique. So I wanted to ask you, what are some of the life experiences or factors that have shaped you as a poet and sort of helped to free that unique poetic voice that's all yours?
Hmm. Uh,
I mean, you write a lot about loss, and I'm sure there's
yes,
stories there that you
I
probably don't want to tell, but what would you say?
this is a difficult question. Um, I'd say there are, I think it's always the desire to running away from life that shapes my poetry, running away from reality, uh, running away from the abundance and recreate this abundance in the form of language and of poetry. I think that has been my old strategy of writing these poems. Specific life experience, well, the Foretaste of Disaster, it was always whimsical, I'd say, a moment of life that's being transformed into imagination, then distilled into language. I think that's the whole process. Isn't a coherent or interesting narrative about it, but it's always the fragments of life that's being scattered and reformed.
Wow.
Yeah.
I think you just redefined poetry as the fragments of life
I
scattered
dare not.
and
I dare not.
reformed. It's a wonderful definition. So on the back cover of your book, I'm going to get to something a little different. It says that your verses evoke the music of ancient Chinese music and poetry. Why is that? I mean, there are a lot of references to music in your poetry. I'm going to ask you about that in a minute. But this reference to ancient Chinese poetry being linked to your poetry, were you influenced a lot by the ancient Chinese poets?
Absolutely. I grew up forced by my family to recite hundreds and hundreds of ancient Chinese poetry, which I memorized by heart, which I hated at that time. But now I appreciate that. And because of that recitation, I internalized some of the rhythmic pattern of the Chinese poetry. And I think whenever I write, the music always comes to me first and the meaning after. So some of the rhythmic pattern just continues in my work, even if I'm writing in English. In this book, there are attempts where I try to marry the musicality of two vastly different languages through different technical aspects, experiments. For example, the poem "Hong Long Long" is the sound of thunder. That poem is purely a sonic poem. Even the intonation in Chinese cannot be transferred in English, but the rhythmic pattern can somewhat be mirrored. And there was a time I wrote poems in classical Chinese meters and translate them into English. And it was odd to retain the rhythmic quality. The translation is often warped. I would sacrifice meaning for the authenticity of the music. And sometimes the poems just seem like carefully rendered gibberish. Yeah, they are. Even now, I think I'm still trying different ways to make that dialectic conversation between two languages clearer with more clarity. And it's an ongoing task.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I get it because I write, one of my passions is I like to write haiku. But haiku in English. But in order, when I became interested in haiku, of course, I started with Basho and a lot of the ancient Japanese haiku poets. And you find the English translations of their poems, and often you'll find 15 different translations of the same poem.
Right.
And it's always so interesting how every single one of those translations is different. And any speaker of Japanese will always say, just like you just said, that you can never, ever, ever pick up the exact meaning of the original in translation. Yeah, it just doesn't work. Yeah, there's intonations and there's rhythm to the language that you just can't capture in translation. So that was very interesting what you said. Thank you. So back to the music. References to music, and in particular classical music, are playing throughout your book. And your poem Beethoven is a great example of that, just by the virtue of the title alone. But do you think poetry and music, and poetry and classical music in particular, are a good match, good pairing?
Well, the honest answer is I don't know. I'm simply inspired by classical music. I mean, it's imagination that is not dictated by meanings entirely. For me, it's just a form of freedom. And classical music was just my obsession. And the reason being it's quite personal and autobiographical was that I had insomnia very early in my age, chronic insomnia, and my father at the time told me to listen to the Well-Tempered Clavier by Johann Sebastian Bach. And he said, this will put you to sleep. And then I started listening to it. I couldn't stop. I stayed up all night just listen to Well-Tempered Clavier, and it was just fantastic. And I couldn't understand it. And then since then, classical music has been accompanying my life, my growth. I learned a lot from it. Most importantly, the structure aspect, the forms, the tempo, how to build up an escalation, so on and so forth. I'm not sure if they're a good pairing or not. I'd just say the reason I use it, it's quite private and personal interest.
Right. You have this wonderful sort of merging of the ancient Chinese poetry that's now built into your DNA, and now the classical music, which is also kind of built into your DNA and kind of contributing to your voice as a poet. It's wonderful to think about. Kind of an off the cuff question I'm going to surprise you with, but if you had to choose one classical music composer to compose the soundtrack of your poetry, who would it be?
Oh dear, I want to select a lot of them. Right now I have three names, and I want them to compose for different chapters of my book.
Yes, why not?
I adore Franz Schubert. Schubert, he's one of my favorites, especially his late piano sonatas. They're just incredibly metaphysical, and I think it was a transformation of the melancholy, of the sorrow, of grief somehow into a peaceful, like, it's just my imagination of it, my interpretation of it. And another would be Johannes Brahms, whom I had a very difficult relationship with when I first started listening to his work, because I couldn't get into it and couldn't understand. And after I listened to his piano concerto, first piano concerto, I just couldn't stop. And actually right now I'm working on a poem about that concerto.
Really?
Yes. And the last one would be, again, one of my all-time favorite, Gustav Mahler. But I think currently my poems are too small for his canvas. I will strive to live up to his composition of the symphony. Yeah.
Well, on that note, would you be willing to read Beethoven for us?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, well, thank you.
Beethoven. Deep autumn, my neighbor starts to wonder, how am I going to live? I want to die. Life has depleted its sustenance. No telephone, no text from you. I listen to Beethoven, learning how to go on even if I'm betrayed by the present. In 2 hours, it's going to rain. The streets will be completely bare. The world grotesque like a stretcher. Future full of meanness, vatic with voids. Late sonatas of Beethoven are different from his earlier works. His more familiar, famous lessons on strength and light. Pedagogical arpeggios, polished by time and torments of time like a leaf stuck in the window pane. Sonata number 31, for example, is but a magpie with its wings and tail chopped off. Even if you don't want life, you live by eating, sleeping, loving without an object. You pray and your prayer comes true. All this is but a dream of feathers. I wait for the pianist's fingers to slide back into her pockets.
Wow. Thank you. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
So, other than poetry and music, do you have any other favorite pastimes that you, I mean, I know you're studying and you're super busy, but anything else that you enjoy doing to sort of?
I like walking a lot.
Walking.
Yeah, I like to just go for a walk for hours.
Yeah.
I like to, and especially when I'm stuck in writing, I like to take showers a lot. I love swimming, and that's also one of my practice. Yeah.
Yeah. Walking is great for getting the sort of brain turning, I find. I write a lot of my haiku while walking my dogs.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
How many haikus can you write on one walk?
Usually 2 or 3. They're not always good ones, but I'll come up with at least 2 or 3. Usually I'm working on a challenge. I'm part of like a haiku group haiku crew. We write haiku each week on a theme, so like on a season word.
Oh, that's so cool.
So last week's season word was hibernation.
Hibernation.
Yeah, this week we're doing Groundhog Day. So I'm always like,
oh, right.
Yeah, so each week is a new theme. So as I'm walking the dogs, I'm thinking, okay, Groundhog Day. What the heck can I do with Groundhog Day?
Weirdly connect to a haiku in my mind. I think it's by Basho Busan. Year after year, on the monkey's face, a monkey's face.
A monkey's face, yes.
Yeah, I just thought that's hilarious, but also philosophical at the same time.
Right, exactly. And then that's the greatest haikus are the ones that are a little bit humorous or lighthearted, but have an underlying sort of deep philosophical sort of life meaning. Yeah. So you are, what are you now, 26, you said?
27 now.
27 now. You've written a book, an amazing collection of poetry. You're still so early in your poetry writing career. What's next for you? Are you working on any new poems, any new books coming?
I am working on something new, but to me, it's all a mystery. I think I'm trying to find a different way of thinking, a different mind with a different language. I'm still trying to figure out what's happening around me and with my writing. And I enjoy the process of exploration and be surprised by myself. And plans, but I don't expect a book. But my most ambitious future plan would be just to write another page of poem. And that's all I ask for my tomorrow.
Well, I believe you're going to be featured in Poets and Writers magazine next issue, or the current issue, coming up issue.
I think the current issue.
Issue, January, February issue. I think it's hitting newsstands this week, I think, or it's already out. I'm not sure, but I haven't tracked it down yet, but I will. So look for Shangyang Fang in Poets and Writers magazine, the current issue. So to wrap up here at the end, will you read another poem for us? And if you want to tell us a little bit about that poem before or after, it's up to you.
I'll omit the part of telling about the poem. I just read the poem.
Absolutely. Works for me.
The poem is called Tether. The tea is turning cold. It holds a winter in its mind. Soon it will be a mattress of Deadpool, and the beetles will lather their brittle shells in this blue bathroom. The birds continue sighing, I'd rather. I write to make myself unrecognized. Inside the sterilized window, the spruce stays, magpies erased. The mountains are approaching, my lines must be revised. Because you were right. It's best to read Russian novels in winter. It is always snowing. Everyone is sad.
I just saw Dr. Zhivago on TV a couple days ago.
That's wonderful.
It's a great movie.
It is a great movie and a great book.
Even better book.
And the poems in it are also just purely wonderful.
Well, thank you, Shangyang Fang. This has been
Thank you for making this possible.
Thank you for taking the time to come on the program. And I wanted to say to everyone out there, I hope you enjoyed that. Check out Shangyang Fang's new book, Burying the Mountain. Again, I'll put the link in the comment section below. And hope you enjoyed it. Hope everyone's well, stay well, and we'll see you again real soon, right here on Poetry Passages. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.